Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 2, Episode 6, Lost in Translation. Well, this was one of the better episodes of NuTrek. I'm only talking about the base story of beings living in the fuel, but unfortunately that wasn't an original idea and was actually the plot of a Doctor Who episode titled 42. This was Season 3, Episode 7 of New Who, for lack of a better description. It was a 10th Doctor, as in David Tennant, and Martha Jones episode. In this episode, the Doctor and Martha find themselves on a ship caught in a sun's gravitational pull, and the ship is unable to get out of this gravity well. The crew members, one by one, are being possessed by something. It is causing them to sabotage the ship and to kill other crew members and also recruit other crew members to do more sabotage. And by recruit, I mean infecting them. Individuals who were infected would keep repeating, "Burn with me." As it turns out, the ship's captain had scooped fuel from the sun without first scanning for life. And, of course, there was life present. And the solution in the end was to dump the fuel, and the life form they had disturbed let the ship go. This brings us to the NuTrek version of this story. The Enterprise is in a nebula that is a stellar nursery, the birthplace of new stars. The Federation has set up a refinery for deuterium in the nebula that's used to fuel starships. The refinery doesn't work. It turns out it's been sabotaged by a lieutenant who has been hallucinating. And like this lieutenant, Uhura has been hearing a sound and hallucinating. In her hallucinations, she sees dead people like Hemmer or the shuttle crash that killed her parents. Pike doesn't take Uhura seriously, nor do Spock or Nurse Chapel, but a visiting James T. Kirk does. Uhura finally figures out that she and the Lieutenant Saboteur are being used as receivers by invisible aliens. Uhura and James Kirk go see Sam Kirk, who specializes in this kind of thing, and Sam starts talking about extra-dimensional aliens. Uhura realizes the aliens are trying to communicate that they are being killed. Uhura tells Pike that they mustn't activate the refinery, and Pike tells her it's too late. The refinery has already been activated. When they try to shut down the refinery, they can't. The only way to stop it is to blow up the refinery, which kind of seems to me that that action should kill more of those aliens, but the refinery is blown up. The fuel is dumped by the Enterprise and the Farragut, which is also there, and the aliens are satisfied and leave Uhura in peace. The episode ends with Uhura, James Kirk, and Spock sitting at a table in, I guess, NuTrek's version of 10 Forward, but on a pre-TOS Enterprise. That's kind of weird, but whatever. During this episode, we had crew members referring to the refinery as a gas station, which seems odd given that gas stations shouldn't be a thing by then. In fact, they should be, long gone. This is like hitching posts for horses. In fact, we're closer to that than they should be to gas stations, but whatever again. There was also a running theme about dealing with death. This came from Uhura and Hemmer, and Uhura dealing with her family, and Una dealing with the death of Hemmer, with some of the grief at the loss of Hemmer being directed toward Pelia, even though obviously it's not her fault. We also had in this episode a cringy scene where Spock and Nurse Chapel are discussing reporting their relationship to Starfleet, and Nurse Chapel compares their relationship to Schrodinger's cat. That was one of the worst things I've ever seen. It was so bad it made the awkward scene between La'an and James Kirk look almost good. It was really that bad. And that was pretty much it. Again, if you want to watch a better version of this, watch Doctor Who's 42, or better still, watch The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 18, Home Soil. It wasn't that there were aliens in the fuel, but they had overlooked aliens that were living on what appeared to be a dead planet, and then when they went to terraform it, they were going to be killing all of those aliens. I thought that was a much better story than this. This season of Strange New Worlds, again, this wasn't a new world, this was a nebula. Again, that's getting kind of pedantic about the whole thing, but I wish I would see something original. I want to see a Strange New World, and I don't want it to be a copy of something that somebody else has written already. I want to see something original from them, and I'm just not seeing it.
The lack of originality with these writers, not just these two, but this production in general, is becoming problematic. I do agree this was probably the best episode of Strange New Worlds, but when one looks at last season, which episode did we tend to agree was the best episode of season 1 of Strange New Worlds?
Well, it was the Ursula Le Guin ripoff.
Right. This episode borrowed heavily from Doctor Who's 42. And there was a little bit of the home soil in there. Instead of a refinery, it was a terraforming outlet. But you take Doctor Who's 42 and you take home soil, and you have like 80 to 90% of this episode.
Yeah.
It's not common tropey, because at first we were talking and we're like, well, this is kind of a derivation of Solaris, the 1972 movie that was redone in the early 2000s. But then as the story went along, it's like, no, there was a lot of deviation there. Just kind of the formless entity that's creating visions of older people that the people knew to interact with. That's like the only similarity to Solaris. That one I'm willing to say is just kind of okay. That's just a little bit of a inspired by idea. That one I'm fine with. But the Doctor Who 42, now I don't know. Maybe Chris Chibnall, he is not the best person to be talking about when it comes to original, awesome storytelling. So Chris Chibnall might have borrowed his 42 idea from somewhere else. But if you just look at 42 on itself, this episode borrowed heavily from that. This is beyond coincidence. It's possible that these people who watched Doctor Who back in, I think it was 2007 that the episode came out, maybe they didn't even know they were influenced that much by the episode. But the concept of they were refueling, the fuel itself was alive, and the fuel was trying to get them to stop taking in more fuel and kidnapping/killing their life forms. So they were making the life forms on the ship sabotage the ship so it would stop doing it. That was so similar in these two. I had some pieces of this episode I actually did try to enjoy. And the problem that I had is when there were pieces to enjoy, which I would argue this episode was, I think, 50 some minutes, like 52 minutes or something. The first 35 minutes, I was on and off trying to get involved with the story. The problem was, anytime I got involved with the story or was trying to, they would do something stupid. Like they would do something with Uhura, or they would do something with Ace Ventura and Discount Drummer. And it would take me out of trying to get into the story.
Yeah, the rivalry, the sibling rivalry that they set up between James Kirk and his brother Sam, I don't know where that comes from. I don't remember them ever addressing that in the original series, that there was a rivalry between the two. It just seems to me that in writing these characters younger as a prequel, they seem to think that just making them insecure is the way to make them younger versions of themselves. And that, I don't agree with that.
This actor they got, Paul Wesley, he might be a fine actor. I honestly haven't seen him in anything else, but I'm not going to take away any sort of positive acting ability he has. But he's not James Kirk. No matter how much you squint and try to pretend this is just a younger version, there is nothing about James T. Kirk here. I know it's a bit petty, but both with William Shatner and later with Chris Pine, they had a certain body shape to them, because I had issues with the story of JJ's 2009 Star Trek, but the casting I think I was pretty okay with. I think Simon Pegg was the only one I didn't like on who they cast for what character. But the Chris Pine casting of Captain Kirk, I was fine with that. I could actually see during some of the lines that weren't cringy in JJ's Trek, where there could have been a Captain Kirk underneath there. But when I'm seeing this Paul Wesley, his body type is all wrong. He would be better playing Spock than he would be playing Captain Kirk. And I don't know why they keep pushing this character into these stories. The James Kirk character was not needed at all in this story. The only reason he was added into this was so he could have that corridor moment when he was talking to Discount Drummer. And that was a callback to the hot dog episode that was cringy.
I think the other reason that they did this, they had him on there, was because in TOS, it was supposed to be that James Kirk met Captain Pike briefly when Pike was promoted to fleet captain. It seems like, even though they pretty much told us that this is a separate timeline, they admitted that in that Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which was also written by David Reed, by the way. But it felt like they were trying to make this fit into the original timeline that way.
I agree. They were doing that fleet captain thing to try to tie it back to the menagerie when Kirk was talking about when he met Pike. But then right after that moment in Strange New Worlds where Pike was talking about his promotion, then they talked about the Gorn and the border dispute that's happening with the Gorn. And we already know in Arena, Starfleet did not know about the Gorn or who the Gorn were. So they try to tie this to continuity, and then like a minute after that, actually less than that.
It was the next breath, pretty much.
They start talking about the Gorn. It's like, well, if you're going to try to tell me this is lining up with continuity because Pike got his fleet captain status, and then later in the episode, he meets Kirk, and then you talk about the Gorn. Well, one of those things wrecks continuity lining up, and that would be the Gorn. So I'm still aligning this with Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow when they admitted that this is a different continuity. This is still a different continuity. I don't know why they keep trying to line things up, but they do. Now, there were parts of this episode I actually liked in isolation. I just wish they would have done it in a different story. We got to see Hemmer again in a recording. It reminded me how much I missed that character in this show. That's what this did for me. But this could have been an interesting story. Like, let's say this was the first episode of this season. They were having trouble dealing with Hemmer being gone and having a replacement come in. And Uhura was looking at old recordings, and like Hemmer just popped up because she forgot that Hemmer was on one of these videos teaching her how to do something. There were parts of this story with Uhura, with Hemmer and her, that I think could have been good if it would have been done in a proper episode, a slower burn type episode where she was finally having to deal with Hemmer being gone, and then her problem going all the way back to her family about having trouble dealing with death. This could have been a good story for Uhura. It really could have. But that piece was like jammed in here. That's what this entity or entities in this fuel nebula, that's what they were using these visions to try to communicate to Uhura. And it didn't work for me. But there was a good story here, I think, with Uhura if they would have done it a different way.
I agree with you on that. And I go so far as to say that the parts where they started talking about how they were having trouble dealing with death, it felt, again, like they were writing this for a tween audience, the level of discourse when it comes to death. And it's very disappointing because I just feel like the level of discourse back for like TNG, because we went ahead and rewatched Home Soil after we watched this episode, and I feel like the intelligence level, the writing level, the comprehension level was aimed higher back during TNG than what they're aiming for now.
I think the Hemmer part was the only part I really cared for. And that cared for means I'm imagining it being done a different way. Because they also had a story kind of related to that, where Una was having troubles with Pelia, and it turned out at the very end that it was because Una was having trouble dealing with Hemmer's death again and having Pelia replace him. That didn't follow why that was in there. Or at least with Uhura and Hemmer, I remember in season 1 when they were working together on stuff and they were forming a friendship. So the Uhura piece made sense to me. The Una piece just seemed kind of shoved in there because they don't know what to do with Una other than she is a victim of some sort of speciesism when it comes to augments. That's like Una's whole purpose is that. She doesn't serve any other purpose.
Yeah.
And Carol Kane's character, there was a little bit of likability at the very end when she was trying to tell Una, you can keep hating me if you want, but I don't think it's me you're mad at or something like that.
Well, she basically told Una that it's okay for Una to just, to keep believing that she is angry with Pelia because that Pelia had given her a C on some paper back when Una was back in the academy. She was basically giving Una permission to just keep not dealing with Hemmer's loss.
The dialogue at the very end with Una when they were talking about that's when I'm saying that Carol Kane's character was a little bit likable. But every other scene in this episode leading up to that with Pelia in it, I found her to be just difficult to tolerate. The only positive I'm going to give is at least at this time we didn't have to turn the subtitles on to understand what Pelia was saying. Because that accent she was playing in the previous 2 appearances that she had, it was difficult to understand it without turning on the subtitles. So at least here you could understand her. But that whole Una scene, maybe done in a different way, I would have been okay with that. The only part of this episode that, looking back on it, that I enjoyed was seeing Hemmer on her iPad and Uhura dealing with looking at the image of Hemmer and reminding her that he wasn't there anymore. And the thing is, it also reminded me how much Hemmer was a much better character than anybody else on this show. And I think that's what kind of irritated me when it started going on after a while, is this was probably the best episode of Strange New Worlds, but it's because of Hemmer in it is why I enjoyed it. And I've said this many times in many videos. The Hemmer character started out in this series to just be annoying. If you go back and watch season 1, episode 1, he's not really that different than the other annoying characters on this show. As the season went on, Hemmer started being a more and more likable character. At the very end, when they killed him off, he almost felt like he was ready to become a fan favorite type character that an old school Trek person would say, yep, that's the one character that I can latch onto and say, this character's meant for adults.
That's because at the beginning, all he was a public service announcement. He was just the blind guy there to educate others about how to treat blind people. By the end of season 1, he actually had a personality. He wasn't just a checkbox to fulfill. He wasn't there just to educate other people. Because a disabled person's whole existence apparently is to teach somebody else a lesson. In case you didn't catch the sarcasm, that was complete and utter sarcasm there. Because I've seen way too often where the disabled are used as a prop to further somebody else's life or their ideas or just their understanding of the world. The disabled don't exist for your personal enrichment.
Well, going back to TNG and Geordi, who had the character had the same disability. In Strange New Worlds, the actor also was blind. But in TNG, the character of Geordi was blind, but they portrayed him, especially with his visor, that there were things he could do that would go beyond what a quote-unquote healthy individual could do. Hemmer didn't even get, you said by the end of the season, he got killed off before the end of the season. I think it was like 3/4 of the season when they killed him off in that horrible Aliens ripoff.
Yeah.
This episode just reminded me that in their own stupidity, the people behind this series killed off the wrong character. I do not understand that. I would like to see more of Hemmer. And that goes back to one of our predictions that we made last season when they killed him off when we were doing our review of that Aliens ripoff episode. We were joking that watch Hemmer come back as a Force ghost like Obi-Wan was to Luke Skywalker.
The interview that I read with the actor who plays Hemmer, it did say that apparently, well, allegedly, he is going to be brought on in other capacities. I don't know if he's going to be appearing on Discovery in the future or Picard or who knows what. Clearly, he won't be back as Hemmer unless they bring him back as some sort of Force ghost and decide to rip off Star Wars. But
oh God, I hadn't thought of that.
Oh, why not?
He could
rip off everything else.
He could be like the Force ghost talking to Uhura. Mm-hmm. He's like Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan.
Yeah. Oh God.
That's essentially what was happening here, because not only was Uhura seeing Hemmer on that iPad recording on just like how to align some communications array or something, but then she was seeing visions of him like on the bridge and that. And we looked at each other and laughed and said, yeah, they pretty much did what we were predicting, because they knew they screwed up, and Hemmer was an important part of trying to make people accept this as a reasonable franchise. So the fact that Hemmer was in this was mixed for me. I enjoyed seeing him, but then it reminded me of how lacking all the rest of the characters were. And the highlight, I guess, of the episode with the other characters is at least Captain Pike, one, was not cooking this episode, and two, kind of doing captain-y things. But then there's like little nitpicks I could make about the ship itself seems so barren. There was one scene in a corridor where there were some people in it, but the rest of the time, there were like onesie-twosie people walking down the hall corridor, and it was empty. It was like, what, did they get transferred to that refueling station? I mean, why was the ship so empty?
Everyone was at the bar in 10 Forward.
Yeah.
That scene was full of people.
It was. But the rest of the ship seemed empty. And then little things like when Uhura was having hallucinations, and the diagnosis was that she had an overdose of the deuterium, and so she had deuterium poisoning. But then Molly mentioned this, because I don't want to take credit. They gave Uhura a phaser, and she's going down the corridor looking for this one guy that got contaminated and was sabotaging the ship. And Molly said, why did they give her a phaser? She's already admitting to hallucinating. At that point, they were still worried about what she was seeing. And you're going to give a hallucinating person a phaser?
Yeah, and James Kirk knew damn well that she was dangerous because she'd already punched him in the face and broken his nose.
And then my question is, so Discount Drummer, she's supposed to be head of security, right? I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I thought she was head of security. They did have 2 security guards when they found that guy at the beginning of the episode sabotaging things. But through the rest of the episode, I think Discount Drummer was the only security person doing anything. The rest was like Uhura or visiting James Kirk. Where was the rest of these people? I want to say more positive things about this episode, and I think I would have, except it was really, really, really borrowing from 42. So the pieces that I thought were atmospheric and creepy, I got that same feeling from 42. So I guess I can give credit that they gave me the same feelings that I got from that Doctor Who episode. I would have had a much different review if the story would have went down a little bit differently. The mood was a bit different in this episode. This was like they were trying to tell a Star Trek episode. So I want to give this episode credit, but after you watch Doctor Who's 42, which, by the way, if any of you aren't sure what we're talking about, but you have access to Max, what used to be HBO Max, why don't you just watch the episode? I think you can figure out without watching the whole series. It's kind of a self-contained story. So other than knowing the Doctor visits places and tries to fix things, that's all you need to know. So Season 3, Episode 7 of New Who, I guess as Molly said they're calling it. Why don't you watch that episode and then compare it to the story of this episode, and then you can let us know if we're being too harsh or not. Because between that and TNG's Home Soil, which was Season 1, Episode 18, if you watch both the Doctor Who episode and TNG, then rewatch this episode, then tell me how good you think it is. Because the majority of the ideas that were like, hey, that might be a cool idea, it was taken from somewhere else. The Hemmer stuff was really the only original stuff here. That's why I'm giving it credit. This episode's best part to me was the Hemmer stuff. And I'm saying a guy on an iPad recording was the best part of the episode. And I'm not trying to trivialize that. It actually was the best part of the episode. And then at the end, when the creatures were released from the fuel storage of the starships, Uhura saw this vision of Hemmer, and Hemmer looked at her and smiled. And again, I'd rather see Hemmer on board doing stuff like that. Just with a facial expression, he was more enjoyable to watch than everybody else on this TV show.
Yeah, and I'm sure if I sat and thought about it, I could probably think of some story somewhere where aliens or creatures or beings or something were trying to communicate using hallucinations.
Well, Solaris was a little bit of that, the movie, but yeah, not to this extent.
No. As I said, I'm sure if I sat and thought long enough, I probably could come up with that. But 42, man, that jumped out at me right at the very beginning when they had that refinery and they were sucking up all of the deuterium out of that nebula. I was like, shit, this is going to be 42.
And then they had the crew members sabotaging the ship to get them to stop. That also happened in 42.
It was, yeah. I mean, I'm so tired of being able to pick things out at the very beginning of the episode. Like, shit, this is where they borrowed this from. And knowing that I had a better time watching the original or, the other version anyway, that may not have even been original either. As I said before, I'm tired of their borrowed stories being lesser. Nothing's original. Nothing is really all that inspiring. I actually feel depressed having watched this show every week because it really is that sad that there is that kind of lack of creativity.
What I don't understand, and maybe we're just getting a bad sampling by looking online, not our commenters. I mean, we look at you guys, what you write too, but just looking online. And people don't seem to notice the borrowing of stuff here. And I'm being kind by calling it borrowing because I want to call it thievery. And I don't understand. It's not like Molly and I are these cinematic aficionados where all we do is watch all science fiction all the time. These are like pop culture things, like the bare minimum for a person to say, yeah, I like the science fiction TV or movie genre. And we're picking up on this stuff. And I don't understand why more people aren't picking up on the stolen material, or maybe they do know it and they're like, well, it's okay to steal. Which, if you're younger, it makes me wonder if you've ever been taught what plagiarism is and why it's wrong. Because maybe you don't think plagiarism's wrong. So 2 weeks ago, when they redid Homer's Odyssey and the Lotus Eaters, we were okay with that. That was borrowed stuff, but it was borrowed versus stolen because in the title of the episode, you'd have to not pay attention to know that was borrowed from something else. They gave credit to what they were doing.
Because they wouldn't have to pay Homer for borrowing his story.
Well, there's nowhere to pay, so they could have gotten away. This is the one author they could have gotten away with stealing from.
Yeah.
But whoever did this decided we're going to put this in the title because we want to make sure people know we're borrowing from this. Mm-hmm. I'm fine with that if in some way you show that you're borrowing versus stealing.
Unfortunately, outside of what they borrowed wasn't very good. But, yeah, at least give credit where credit is due.
Even if in the credits here, it said something like, I don't even know how they would phrase that, because in this case, it's not even like, based on a story by Chris Chibnall from Doctor Who, that would seem
they'd get sued.
Yeah, exactly.
They'd get sued.
So you can't do that. So I just wish they would have mixed it up a little bit more. And like you said, Chris Chibnall is not what we would consider to be one of the great authors out there. So it's possible Chris Chibnall stole the ideas for 42 from somewhere else. But we're not familiar with where he stole it from. If he did steal it. But we do know 42, and we do know that it is so similar to this episode that I have to call it out as this is stolen material.
Yeah.
And the Hemmer part was the only original part of this that I actually enjoyed.
Yep.
For not being plagiarized. The rest of it, I could have gotten into it if they would have done a different thing. And they need to stop injecting. Whenever they get some momentum going story-wise, then they inject this stupidity in there. So I only get like maybe 30 seconds of, hey, I'm kind of getting into this, and then they do something stupid. Can't you just let the story go for a while, let some momentum build up so I can get in, I can immerse myself into the story? No, they can't do that. I think this was one of the better episodes of Strange New Worlds, possibly the best. But much like last season's best episode, it was stolen. The ideas were stolen from different places. I think there were 2 places this was stolen from, 42 and the Next Generation Home Soil. But still, it's stolen. Instead of stealing from one place, you steal from 2 places. That doesn't make it much better. Overall, would I recommend this? If you're not familiar with the material we're talking about, and you want to watch a knockoff story, okay, watch it. You'll probably like pieces of it. I would just argue the pieces you like were better done in the stuff they borrowed from.
Yeah, instead, watch The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 18, Home Soil, and Doctor Who, New Who, Season 3, Episode 7, 42. If you haven't seen it, YouTube has finally given the old man access to our community tab. So we have actually started using that. So go ahead and check that out. New place for exchanging ideas. Fortunately, that was there so that I could post a picture of a Trapper Keeper because I had forgotten to do that in last week's video. And of course, silly me, I forgot. Not everyone knows what a Trapper Keeper is. So go ahead and check out that community tab and there will be extra things for everyone to interact with. Anyway, anybody else watch this? Are you familiar with those other franchises? Well, I guess... yeah, no, I would consider TNG to be a different franchise, definitely at this point. So, anybody familiar with those? What were your thoughts on this? Leave your comments in the space below.
Take care.